Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third part of our very important series, Why Are Central Banks in Name Only? Why do they more closely resemble janitors, cleaning up after the mess? We're asking Jeff Snider, the head of global research for Alhambra Partners. Jeff, we've gone through parts 1, parts 2, part 3, and now we are going to be discussing this article, When You Aren't Actually a Central Bank, part 2, The Stubborn Deflation. And I'm going to pull up lovely infographic that you made, and this infographic is the mainstream media narrative, right? And then we'll get to what happened.
Yeah, before we start, let's review what a central bank is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the guy, the agency, the institution that comes in and makes sure the crisis doesn't develop. You know, currency elasticity. Something starts to develop. We see some liquidity problems in the monetary system. The central bank steps in right away. Everybody's happy. And if you talk about the Montague-Norman doctrine, the Bank of England at that time, 1930s. Nobody even knows the central bank even steps in. It just maintains monetary sufficiency at all times. That's what a central bank does. Lender of last resort.
Now, this is the classic view, right? The Bagehot and Montague, did you just say? So this is the classic understood way of doing it. Because don't we sometimes hear central bankers saying, well, we shouldn't get in front of an asset bubble? Am I conflating two different things?
Yeah, the asset bubbles don't even apply here. We're talking about monetary system, which is the market for money, not financial markets.
Okay.
And that's another thing when we're talking about this transformation from lender of last resort to market of last resort. The Fed is even stepping out of the monetary system and paying more attention to asset markets than money, which again goes to the fact that it's not actually a central bank. So keep that in mind as we go forward. We talked about in part 1 and got it back into in part 2 a little bit. What is the central bank actually supposed to do? It's supposed to stand in front of the crisis and say, I'm going to lend currency elasticity when the market is inelastic. When by market, I mean first. Money market. Market for money is inelastic, not the stock market, not debt markets or things like that.
All that is built on top of the money market.
Yes, it's supposed
commodities, currencies, assets, all that stuff comes off of money market, and the central bank should be in the money market. But as we've talked hundreds of times already, the Federal Reserve and many banks stopped doing money in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and the private system took over. Jeff, gorgeous, wonderful, sophisticated infographic. I'm teasing a little, but I love these infographics. Okay, so the mainstream narrative, here we go.
Yeah, so we'll go back to what we did in part 2, which was what actually happened last year in March, actually starting in February of 2020. We had a wave of foreign reserve dealers selling their off-the-run US Treasuries, either in the marketplace or trying to dump them on the hands of dealers who were obliged to buy them.
Part 2.
That supposedly clogged up the repo market. Remember, this is a mainstream narrative. Mm-hmm. Because of all of these involuntarily purchased from the perspective of the dealers, they were involuntarily purchased, and usually those involuntary purchases are financed in the repo market. You have this sudden wave of illiquid, off-the-run Treasury collateral hitting the repo market all at once when the repo market was ill-suited or unable to handle that essentially volume of emergency activity.
Number 3.
Of course, if the repo market's plugged, dealers as well as reserve managers don't have much choice. What are they going to do? If you can't finance these sales that you've already bought, then you have to sell the asset. You don't have any other recourse. So you have this wave of selling from dealers as well as reserve managers who weren't able to able to find any dealers to take these illiquid treasuries off their hands. So you have waves of treasury market off-the-run selling going on. And as we talked about in the last part, there actually isn't a market for these things, at least a standing market for these things, which meant that these were increasingly distressed sales of actually illiquid, risk-free U.S. Treasury assets.
Since 2008, the Federal Reserve hasn't been standing still, Jeff Snider. They have been reviewing what happened, and they were prepared that should another financial crisis happen, they would be able to step in quickly. Instead of taking months, it would only take weeks. Part 4.
Yeah, that's another episode we'll get into, the whole we're prepared and we're quickly and all that stuff. Remember, this didn't happen until March 15th, which was a Sunday, after a tremendous amount of destructivity had already taken place, before the Fed finally said that late on that Sunday evening, oh, we're going to do a QE6, which means, of course, which entails buying a lot of US Treasury securities. So from the perspective of Jay Powell and the FOMC, what they were doing was essentially bailing out this illiquid Treasury market that had broken down. As we said, the FOMC minutes declare that the all function in that Treasury market, the off-the-run part of it, had essentially ceased to exist. So the Fed comes in, swoops in as Superman, takes all of these illiquid assets off the hands of dealers and reserve managers alike, and of course that means success, happy days, very limited fallout, recovery, full recovery, markets, everything. It was just, everything was a complete and utter success.
And they say that unicorns aren't real. Okay, so then...
This is the market of last resort. And as the market of last resort doctrine, of course, the mainstream focus has been on only those last two parts of it, where the Fed steps in and starts buying lots of illiquid treasuries, and that's all we really know, right? The Treasury market broke down, and the Federal Reserve and Jay Powell saved it just in the nick of time before it got even worse than it might have been. And that's really a repeat of what happened in 2008 when the Fed came in finally at the end, December of 2008 into 2009, and said this basically the same thing. Markets have broken down, and we've stepped in to start buying assets in these illiquid marketplaces. Market of last resort doctrine.
Maybe it broke down because there were too many treasuries, Jeff, and the U.S. government was too profligate and in depth. I'm teasing you. We don't have to get into that.
No, and that's fine. This is a corollary to that argument, that the Treasury market itself can't handle this volume of this potential volume of securities. And of course, as we ended part two with, there's that nagging little question in the back of your mind that says, well, wait a minute, Jay. Why was everybody selling treasuries in the first place? I get, the treasury market broke down, but that kind of seems like it's toward the end of the process, not the entire process or even the beginning of the process to begin with, right? We're missing something here. Yeah, okay, the treasury market broke down, but why did it break down? Why was there so much selling in the first place?
And so now this is the Eurodollar perspective.
Yeah, let's look at this realistically. There's no rainbows and unicorns here because obviously anybody who remembers March of 2020 and its aftermath is not going to credit the Federal Reserve with doing a very good job, because one thing after, just like 2008, one thing after another, whatever the Fed did, nothing seemed to stop the crisis, including their heroic purchase of treasuries. Because remember, they announced it on the 15th. There's still another week of liquidation sweeping across the world. So it wasn't really that they bailed out the treasury market. They just happened to coincide their beginning of their purchases with towards the end of the liquidation waves.
Jeff, let me just step in for a second. Earlier you said QE6, and if anyone is watching this video and they don't watch it often, this is the first time they've seen it, I'm worried that they may say, Jeff Snider's a crazy person because this would be QE4. We've gone over this a number of times. Just because the Federal Reserve doesn't announce a QE doesn't mean they didn't do a new QE. And so we had QE4 in 2012.
December 2012, yep.
And then
that was distinct from QE3, which was announced in September of 2012.
Yep.
So there's two QEs at the end of 2012.
And then we had the not QE from October 2019.
October 2019, yep. That was not QE, but it really was, except it was focused entirely on Treasury bills, which we already had an episode on that where we showed that was a ridiculous folly too. So that was QE, that's what we call QE5, because it was legitimately QE5 until March of 2020 when the Fed stopped buying Treasury bills, tacitly admitting they had screwed up in Treasury bills. They started this QE6, which was very different, buying especially these off-the-run treasuries.
Forgive the digression, Jeff. It just occurred to me that I was just worried that somebody would turn off the channel if they heard QE6, and that's not mainstream approved. Okay, so what happened then? What's number two now?
So if we're looking at this realistically, what actually happened last year was, yes, there was a wave of reserve managers selling their illiquid treasuries. But that's not what, quote unquote, clogged the repo market. The repo market had already been impaired. And so the wave of selling in off the run treasuries was coincident to repo market impairment. In fact, it contributed to what was already taking place. It was one of those things that becomes self-reinforcing, where you have one problem on top of another problem becomes an even bigger problem. So it wasn't that the foreign selling and dealers trying to finance that foreign selling and repo, impaired repo, those things happen simultaneously. And in fact, there's a great deal of data, as I've gone through many, you can read all the stuff on our website from February on into March of 2020. You can see there's a great deal of evidence that the repo market actually was impaired before the wave of foreign selling started, which goes back to why were they selling in the first place. But either way, these things happen simultaneously. Foreigners start selling these treasuries. Dealers have enormous problems financing those sales. They start selling them into the illiquid marketplace. Foreigners start dumping them into the liquid marketplace. So then we have the off-the-run part of the treasury market goes haywire, where everybody then herds into the on-the-run stuff, because that's the only things left usable in the repo market, as the FOMC actually admitted in their FOMC minutes that we talked about in part 2. So you don't have the treasury market, quote unquote, the treasury market breakdown. You have part of the treasury market breakdown, and curiously, an important part of the treasury market that didn't break down and continue to function because of reasons that have everything to do with everything.
Well,
so Jay Powell steps in.
Yes.
He doesn't bail out the treasury market, does he? He just starts buying the off-the-run stuff that is causing that's causing all these problems in the off-the-run part of the treasury market, while the on-the-run treasury market is all that's left of essentially functionable repo. And that's why we had this multi-week period, no matter what the Fed did, where you had the dollar surge, you have all these waves of liquidations that even reached the stock market and everything else, because liquidity, monetary sufficiency throughout the global system just completely vanished because of all of these other things that happened the first time, predating the quote-unquote breakdown in the treasury market. Jay Powell and QE6 didn't save the day. It was simply their reaction as this market of last resort doctrine to all these other things that happened before then. And what we're really talking about is, obviously, why that treasury market selling overseas started in the first place. Why did the repo market start to become impaired before that even happened? And before the Fed even comes in at the end, what was going on at the front? What was going on at the beginning? And that's where we get into dollar shortage that became so severe and so acute that it created so many downstream problems. It actually got the mainstream and Jay Powell thinking the entire treasury market was blowing up, when in fact that was simply a consequence of what happened before then. Now, a central bank, a legitimate, real central bank, would care about that stuff at the front. But we don't have a central bank. We have the Federal Reserve, which is sort of like, as I said, a janitor who comes in at the end, this market of last resort doctrine, and says, well, I'll start to clean up the mess. Because the mess has gotten so big, I can't ignore it anymore. I'm going to have to clean up a little bit. And that's not what that's not what you're taught in school. That's not what financial markets expect out of the Federal Reserve or a central bank, because they still consider the central bank a central bank. But here we see in practice, that is not what these people do. And again, as I said before, this isn't just about March 2020. The same things happened in 2008, almost identically. And it's one of those things where you have to say, wait a minute, what the hell's going on here? How can we 13 years later still have the same problems? And part of the reason is because these people get away with saying, oh, this market of last resort doctrine works really well. Don't ask any questions about what we do, because we know what we do and we know what we do works well. And it's just simply not true. Again, you have to look at the entire phenomenon together and put all these parts in the right order and start to realize that what really went wrong happened way before the Federal Reserve ever stepped in with its market last resort. And where it went wrong was where a central bank, as Milton Friedman was promised by Ben Bernanke in 2002, where a central bank would have said, we won't allow this to happen again.
Would it be fair for me to include the European Central Bank in 2011 and 12 and the People's Bank of China in 2014 through 16 as similarly being not central banks for those regional Eurodollar crises?
Yeah, I would. The European Central Bank is very much like the Fed. In fact, they're very similar. The Bank of Japan's a little bit different, but yes, I think that they're in the same category. I would put the People's Bank of China in a different category because their monetary system is somewhat different, where the People's Bank of China is still involved in actually printing currency, for example. They have physical currency. So they have more of a central bank element to their doctrine, but yet they're still trying to migrate toward the Western view of this market of last resort doctrine, which is simply a response to the fact that these are not central banks. And if you're not a central bank who is engaged in currency elasticity, what do? And that's really where this market of last resort doctrine comes in. It's basically say, well, we can't prevent the monetary problem from starting, so we'll just kind of hope at the end we can sweep up the mess after it's destroyed a bunch of stuff. And that's where the janitor analogy comes in, because that's what the Fed is actually telling you. We don't prevent crisis anymore. We don't prevent monetary problems. We just try to limit the damage after they've already developed into full-scale conflagrations in all of these marketplaces. And we've seen it now twice in just 13 years. So I would say any reasonable and honest interpretation of events and the evaluation of this doctrine, it doesn't work very well. Now, we haven't yet tallied up the costs of last year, but we have an idea so far of what's going on in the marketplace, and it's not all about COVID and pandemics. It's really about long-run economic harm that so far over the last, especially couple months, is starting to look way, way too much like 2009 and 2010, and the lack of recovery from the last time this market of last resort janitor stuff didn't actually do much in response to what should have been the central bank's first primary task.
You end this article by pointing out that this is not just an academic exercise, that it has real-world consequences for us, the people just going to work and trying to make it through the day and the week.
Assuming you have a job left. We pay the price for this. And I think people should know that the central bank is in its actual function is telling you that it's not a central bank, that we do something very different. And that very different means something that all of these negative implications, they're going to continue to repeat, because the monetary system, as we say repeatedly, broke down in August of 2007. Here we are approaching 14 years later, and the same problems, even identical collateral shortage, all of these things continue to repeat because there's no demand. I mean, the central bankers, they don't feel any of this stuff. It doesn't apply to them. The costs are not borne by them. They get their high-paid sinecures after they retire and all these other things. I mean, they're not suffering for any of this stuff. It's everybody else that does. And the reason we are, which is our mission here at Eurodollar University, is to connect all of these dots, to show you that, hey, the central bank isn't a central bank. And we'll prove it to you. We'll show you what they actually do. And it's not what a central bank does. And that's how we end up in the situation where we have an entire generation of young people turning to Marxism, because they think, well, if this is a booming economy and a functioning central bank, it ain't very good. Let's try something else.
The consequences radiate outward from the eruptions, from the worst moment of the crisis, because our modern economy runs on credit, on banks expanding their balance sheets, and it had for a long time. But guess what? If we've gone through 2, 3, 4 of these episodes now, the banks know they're on their own. Risk perceptions. Okay, the crisis has passed, but I have just seen for the 3rd or 4th time that my central bank won't come in during the percolating stages of the crisis, but at the very end. Dare I step out into the open and take on risk? Not enthusiastically. And therefore that credit doesn't reach the rest of the economy, and we all suffer for it. There's a great bullion famine, a great dollar shortage, a great euro-dollar shortage. Again,
great collateral famine. Think about, in the wake of last year, why are Treasury bill prices so high? Why is it that even now, when everything's supposed to be functioning well, and really everything is functioning relatively well, why is there still this tremendous demand, this tremendous desire to hold on to on the run treasuries. Why is that still a distinction here? And the answer is because, as you just said, Emil, banks know, push comes to shove, what this market of last resort, pardon my language, horseshit actually accomplishes. It doesn't accomplish what it's supposed to. It doesn't accomplish what's on people's mind. And the fact that they applaud themselves and get the mainstream media to applaud their efforts is a big part of the problem, because this is what maintains the system as it is. This is what maintains this market of last resort doctrine, even though it's not suited to what the task that we believe the central bank has been assigned, which again means it's not a central bank.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you do read these 3 articles. They're fantastic. I think this is one of our most important episodes that we've done. I hope it's the most popular. I hope you read it. I hope you absorb this amazing crystallization of what has happened to our central banks and the consequences that we're going to be facing going forward. Jeff, when I upload these podcasts, there's a little checkmark box that says, does this contain explicit content? And I always waver if you throw in one expletive. I don't know how stringent they're going to be. Are they going to come back for that last comment and harass us? I don't know.
If they do, I think in this case it's warranted. I think at this, I try not to use
badge of honor,
too many expletives, but I think that's what's really deserved here.
You're welcome to use as many expletives as you want. That'll make it clear to me. Yes, check the box. But if you just throw in the one. All right, Jeff, awesome, wonderful. I loved it. I really do. I hope the audience reads these articles. I hope they enjoyed the show. Thank you, Jeff, for putting this out, sharing it with us. And have a good day. I'll talk to you again soon.
All right, Emil, take care.